Chapter 11, Cotton, Slavery, and the Old South. In the last chapter, we were mainly focusing on the North. We were talking about industrialization, and remember that mainly took place in the Northeast. So in this chapter, we're going to switch regions a little bit and begin focusing more on the South. And of course, the two most dominant features of the Old South will be cotton and slavery. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about King Cotton and its influence on slavery. And then we're going to talk about slavery itself, the institution, some of the myths, some of the realities, and what it really meant to the South. All right, and let's start off with King Cotton. First thing I want you to understand, and we've already discussed this before, is that slavery is an old practice. It's as old as mankind itself, and even in the United States, by the time of the 1800s, it's in a very, very old practice. Slavery has been practiced since before there was a United States, right? It's been practiced for at least 200 years. That being said, even though it is a very old practice, by the time we get to the 1800s, really, the American South is one of the last regions of the world to have it. And that is why it is referred to as the peculiar institution. Not peculiar as weird or strange, but maybe more as unique. It was something that set the South apart from not only really the rest of the United States, but by this point, really from the rest of the world. Now, and we've already mentioned this, so it's a bit of a review. We've already spoken about the traditional cash crops of the South, things like tobacco and rice and indigo, and how those were actually kind of on their way out. Those crops really drain the land. The money is just not there that they used to be. And so we actually see those crops kind of fading out a little bit, and they will be eventually replaced by cotton. And the reason that cotton is going to grow to dominate the South is really because of this one invention, the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. There are several different types of cotton, and the cotton that is easily grown in the South is very difficult to process, has very long fibers, it's hard to get the seeds out. Well, the invention of the cotton gin allowed for very quick processing of cotton, so now we have cotton that is easy to grow and cotton that is easy to process. And like we said, cotton spreads through the South like wildfire. By the 1850s, cotton accounts for 2/3 of all American exports, not Southern exports, but 2/3 of everything that left the United States for a foreign country was cotton. That's huge. 2/3 of our export market. Now, the reason that cotton is in such demand is because of, number one, the growing textile industry in Great Britain, and number two, the growing textile industry in New England. They were buying as much cotton as they can get their hands on, and cotton farmers are getting filthy stinking rich in the American South. As a side effect to this spread of cotton, though, you will see that slavery also expands. And if you compare this map to the previous map, if you see here that the heaviest grown areas of cotton, places in the Mississippi Delta and through the deep South, Alabama and Georgia, up through South Carolina, those areas where cotton is the most prevalent are also areas where slavery is most prevalent, because the thinking was that slavery was actually on its way out. That as those traditional cash crops began to sort of die out a little bit, we wouldn't need the labor to work the fields anymore, and so slavery would die out as an institution. But cotton revitalizes slavery, and so we see slaves begin to move from the older established area to places like Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana. So we see a shift in slavery from the older, more established areas of the South to the deeper South. And you can see there, of course, the darker the region, the sort of pale yellow, less than 10%, all the way up to the dark orange. More than 50% of those areas were slave populations. And the thing about it is, the effect of cotton on other industry is that it stunted all the other industry because everything was focused on cotton. Everything was about the cotton industry and how to make it better. So, for example, there are no factories in the South. Nobody's investing money in factories. Everyone is investing all their money in more land and more slaves. There are no railroads in the South except what was needed to get cotton to market. There are no banks in the South except what's needed to support the cotton industry. So cotton stunts all other industry, and the other industry that does exist only serves to further cotton. And as a result of this, the South has to rely on the North for pretty much everything. All major loans, any sort of transportation, any sort of finished manufactured good has to come from the North because they're just not produced in the South. And so that led to the South saying, well, we feel like a colony of the North. Just like the American colonies had to depend on England for everything back in the colonial days. So did the South come to depend on the North for everything in the days leading up to the Civil War. And the South resented this. They didn't like feeling like a colony of the North. They didn't like the power that the North had over the South. And so the big question, of course, is why didn't they change it? Why didn't the South do something to change the situation? And it was for a number of reasons. That they didn't have the available capital to invest because everything already was tied up in land. And they just didn't want to. Southerners felt that their way of life was better. It's known as the Cavalier lifestyle. This idea that the Southerners live the genteel life, that they're the aristocracy of the United States, this Cavalier lifestyle where they enjoy the finer things in life, horse racing and sitting around on the front porch and barbecues, and life moves slower in the South, and they don't chase after the almighty dollar like those Yankees up north. You know, they had this mindset that they were living the good life, and they didn't want to change it. So bear that in mind as we go through this chapter. Let's talk about society in the South. You should know that slavery in the South is actually quite limited. Fewer than 25% of families in the South actually own slaves. And only a very small fraction of those own substantial numbers of slaves. And I can't remember the exact numbers. It's something like less than 10% owned 30% of the slaves. Maybe it was less than 1% owned 30% of the slaves. So what you get is you have most of the slaves, or at least a substantial chunk of the slaves, being owned by very few people. Most people in the South are plain folk, and they're subsistence farmers. They grow just enough food to eat. They're the poor farmers of the South. But even the poorest dirt farmer did cling to this Cavalier lifestyle image. You know, this cult of honor, the importance of family ties, this landed aristocracy myth that the South liked to portray itself as. All these formal life function with the debutante balls, and that's the sort of lifestyle that every Southerner respected, even if most of them did not actually participate in them. And then the whole thing about debutante balls leads me into the next sort of Southern stereotype, the Southern lady. And this, of course, is Scarlett O'Hara, who's a fictional character from Gone with the Wind. But she is a stereotype of the Southern lady, that ladies were individuals to be respected and to be protected, but not necessarily taken seriously, right? A woman's place was in the home, and she was seen over by whatever male guardian in her life was, whether that is a brother or a father or later her husband. And in the reality, most Southern ladies do not look like this. They don't act like this. They're not part of the aristocracy, right? In reality, if you're a member of the plain folk class, more likely than not, your wife is probably working out in the fields with you. So this myth about the Southern lady and these Victorian values that the Southern ladies are supposed to adhere to, that is largely a myth. That being said, society is patriarchal and even paternal, and this is kind of interesting because in the views of at least Southern men, slaves and women were very much the same. And the way that they were the same was they were viewed really as people who could not take care of themselves. We'll talk more about this a little bit later. But many slave owners actually felt they were doing the slaves a favor. They felt that if the slaves were just turned loose in the world, that they would not be able to provide for themselves. And so that they were doing the slaves a favor by providing them structure and meaningful work and exposure to Christianity and food and shelter in return for labor. They really thought that they were doing them a social good. But that's this kind of fatherly view that many Southerners have towards not only African Americans but also women as well. That they were childlike, they needed to be protected, even if they didn't know what was the best for them. Now, the typical Southerner, the typical southron, was born into the life that they usually died with. That is, if you're born a poor dirt farmer, you're more than likely going to die a poor dirt farmer. There's no way for people to get ahead. There's very little social mobility. There's no opportunity for most Southerners to climb up the ladder. So, all that being said, if most people don't own slaves, and most people are unable to indulge and participate in this sort of cavalier lifestyle that is enjoyed by maybe the top rung of the social ladder, if there is no social mobility, if most people are plain folk, why do they put up with it? And later, as we get into the Civil War, why do they fight and die for it? Think about this. And we will actually get into this a little bit later, I'm not saying that slavery is the only cause of the Civil War. That is kind of the pat answer. But if the Civil War was fought over slavery and most people don't own slaves, why are they fighting and dying for something that doesn't really even affect them? Well, first and foremost, the isolation. They don't know any better. They argue it doesn't really affect them. They're not part of that society. They're sort of cut off from the rest of the world. Number two is dependence. They depend on the planter class for everything because there are no banks in the South. So if you're a poor farmer and you need a loan, you can't go to a bank. Your best bet is to go to the rich planter down the road. When it comes time to get your cotton to market, and even the poorest dirt farmer usually puts in a little bit of cotton just to sell for some cash money. But when it comes time to sell that cotton, your piddly little 1 acre of cotton isn't going to bring anything at market. So usually you sold it to the planter down the road and they just rolled it in with theirs. And then number three, familial relationships. That planter down the road might be your second cousin, 2 times removed. And that's very, very big in the South. We stress family connections very, very deeply in the South. And so that's a big part of it. You don't want to be seen as working against your kin. All right, let's talk about slavery itself. And as I've mentioned earlier, it really is what sets the South apart. And even though, don't get me wrong, the North greatly benefited from slavery. Remember, northern trading companies are the ones that bought and sold slaves. So please don't think that the northern hands were completely clean. But by the time we get to the mid-1800s, it really is what sets the South apart because slavery has been more or less abolished in the northern states. I want you to know that slavery is a legal institution, and what I mean by that is the behavior of slaves and slave owners is set down in laws. Okay, so this is not, tradition has a lot to do with it, but it's not just a traditional thing. It is legalized. Slaves were seen as property, and so the regulation of property, the regulation of slavery is a legal matter. It is very, very legalized. It is codified into the law. I also want you to realize that the relationship between a slave and his master really depends upon the size of the farm. We mentioned that the majority of people don't own slaves, and only a few own a substantial number of slaves. So think about this. If you are a poor farmer and you own 1 or maybe 2 slaves, your situation is probably not that you can sit back and relax and allow those slaves to do all the work on the farm. Probably more likely than not, if you own 1 or 2 slaves, you're going to be out in the field working right alongside them. And when you work day in and day out with someone, your relationship with that person, even if you are still master and slave, it is going to change quite a bit than if you own 400 slaves and you don't have any actual contact with the slaves, and you have people, foremen, overseers in between you and the slaves. So I do want you to know that the relationship between slaves and their masters, it really does depend quite a bit on the size of the farm in question. Gender roles, this is kind of interesting. And I've seen this argued a number of ways. Some people have argued that gender roles, traditional gender roles, don't really apply to slaves because both men and women were expected to work. A slave is a slave is a slave. Women were not exactly granted allowances because they were women. They were not put on the pedestal that other Southern women might have been. But that being said, at the end of the day, when it came down to cooking and cleaning and taking care of the children, females still bore the brunt of the domestic chores, even if you were a slave. So it was doubly bad to be a female slave because not only were you expected to work in the field alongside the men slaves, you also had to do all the domestic work when you got home as well. Now, I will say that living conditions in the American South were much better than living conditions in the Caribbean plantations, which were simply horrific. The life expectancy of Caribbean slaves working on sugar plantations in the islands and in Brazil, for example, was somewhere around 5 to 7 years. Just horrific, horrific conditions. So it wasn't quite that bad in the American South. And I've also seen the argument, and again, this is controversial, but I've seen some historians make the argument that slaves actually had an easier life than factory workers in the North. And what I mean by that is this. A slave was an investment to its owner. Slaves were very expensive. And so it was in the owner's, if not necessarily moral or human interest, but financial interest, to treat their slaves, give them enough food to eat, provide them with shelter, provide them with adequate clothing, because they were simply protecting their investment. As opposed to the northern factory worker, the factory owner had no such obligation to his workers. If a worker was sick or missed work or whatever, they could fire him, bring somebody off the street, train him up in half a day, and he's good to go. So I've seen the argument made that African slaves actually have better living conditions in the South. That being said, if you ask any northern worker, do you want to be a slave, they would have flat out refused. If you had offered freedom to any African slave to work in a northern factory, they would have taken you up in a heartbeat. So I don't know that I really buy the argument that that slavery was a better way of life than factory workers, because no one would have willingly remained a slave if they were given the option. So, but anyway, I have seen that argument made. House slaves were fairly common throughout the South. And of course, like everything else, it was kind of a double-edged sword, because on one hand, it might not be as great physical labor as working out in the fields all day long, but on the other hand, it also brought you into contact with the white family in much greater quantities. You had much more contact with the white family, and the more contact you had with white people, the more opportunity you had to be punished or to mess up or to do something wrong. Of course, predations against female house slaves happened very frequently throughout the South, and more often than not, unfortunately, it was the slave that was blamed rather than whatever male took advantage of them. So house slavery was really a dual-edged sword for slaves. Slavery in the city is actually pretty frowned upon. The whole idea behind slavery is to provide for an agricultural workforce, and many people, even in the South, really felt like slavery was incompatible with city life, and so it was really kind of frowned upon. I don't know that it was outright illegal anywhere, but it's one of those things that's really kind of frowned upon, bringing your slaves into the city, because that wasn't the way it was supposed to be. We've been talking a lot about slaves, but of course you realize that slavery is bad enough, but the plight of free blacks wasn't much better. And because what it really boils down to, it's not your status as a slave, it's really the color of your skin. And we've already spoken about this in earlier chapters, that when that switch over comes from the law talking about slavery to the law talking about race, that's when the great switchover comes. And so even once you are no longer a slave, and there are free black people. In the years leading up to the Civil War, it's something like, I think there's around 400,000 slaves living in the United States. There are much fewer free black people. I want to say somewhere around probably less than 100,000. But life was not easy. It might have been easier, but it certainly was not easy if you were a free black person instead of a slave. Slave trade, of course, bringing in new slaves from outside the United States was outlawed. It had been outlawed shortly after the turn of the century, but because people born to slaves inherit that slave status, the slave population continued to grow. And like I said, the slave trade, we do see a shift from the more upper South, if that makes any sense, the more established areas of the South down through the deeper southern areas, places like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, on up into South Carolina. Now, slave resistance is an interesting topic. There are actually very, very few instances of armed slave revolts in the United States. And in fact, really the only good example of an armed, large-scale slave revolt is Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia. What happened was Nat Turner was a slave. He convinced large numbers of other slaves to seize weapons, and they tried to fight their way down to Florida. The reason being that slavery in Florida was outlawed as a result. It used to be part of Spain. Slavery was outlawed in Spain, and so the idea was if they could make it to Florida, they would become free men. What happened was a number of white people ended up dying. Most of the slaves did not make it. Some were killed in the fighting. Some were captured and executed. Some did escape to Florida, but most of them did not. But really, that's the only large-scale slave revolt in the United States history. The much more common form of resistance was simply being apathetic. And, you know, that makes sense, right? If you're not getting paid for your work, what incentive do you have to work harder? Now, unfortunately, that also led to the stereotype of slaves as being lazy. But they weren't being lazy. They just had no incentive to work. So that's the most common form of resistance, is just passive resistance, just not working all that hard. And of course, running away, maybe not in these large-scale revolts, but people trying to make it to a free state, thinking if they could make it there, they would be free, which sometimes that worked and sometimes it did not. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. The last thing I want to talk about is the creation of a unique slave culture in the United States, because you have to remember, of course, that Africa is a huge place, right? And just because African slaves came from Africa did not mean that they had anything in common. And so, now, it may not really apply by the time we get to the 1800s, but certainly during the early days of the Republic, if you imported a number of slaves from Africa, they might have as much trouble understanding each other as they had understanding their masters. They might not all speak the same language, or wear the same clothes, or eat the same food, or practice the same religion, right? They were as different from each other as they were from the white families. So what we see is, over time, and by the time we get to the 1800s, that's what I'm getting at, they have created a unique slave culture with its own language. The most famous slave language of which is known as Gullah. They create their own music, which of course the antecedents, taking these traditional African rhythms, the antecedents of things like the American rock and roll, their own religion. Things like hoodoo and voodoo, where they would take their traditional African beliefs and mix them in with the Christianity that they learned from their masters. What would usually happen is that most slaves were forced to attend church with their white family, but then later they might sneak out and hold their own church services. And so we see a melding of of Christianity and traditional African religions. One thing I forgot to mention about the slave trade, of course, was the ever-present threat that families could be torn apart. And often that was used as a threat against these slaves, is that if they did not cooperate, the master would sell the kid off to another plantation. Or if a couple got married secretly and did not ask permission of the master, if he found that out, he might sell one of them down the river to punish that couple. So what we see happening is a great deal of importance being placed on familial ties. So you might not have a mom and dad that live on the farm with you, but you might have an aunt, and you might have a cousin, or you might have grandparents, and you might not have anybody. If you're a brand new slave and you don't know anyone, and you're new to this area and you're new to this farm, you might not have any family members. So you might have an adoptive family of people that look after you. So what I'm getting at, in this slave culture, a huge amount of importance is placed on family ties because it is so rare and because it is so special to have your family around you. So extended, deeply extended family ties become very, very important in slave culture. And